Good afternoon, Minister Freeland. My name is Ewa Krajewska, and I'm counsel for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Minister Freeland, I'd like to start off with going back to your testimony in chief with respect to the Ambassador Bridge. If I understand your testimony correctly, you stated that the blockage of the Ambassador Bridge escalated matters in your mind significantly. That's fair?
So first of all, good afternoon, Ms. Krajewska. Nice, well, maybe I shouldn't say nice.
Maybe you can tell me that later.
Yeah, but good afternoon, and I will try to answer your questions. And I think when you say testimony, you're referring to the
your
2
exchange
hours
with Ms.
this morning.
Chowdhury.
So try to be precise, yes, as finance minister, in my judgment around the economic impact of the illegal blockades and occupation, certainly the blockade of the Ambassador Bridge was a very significant escalation.
Right, and precisely the words you just used now, it was at least at that point, if not earlier, that to your mind, the blockades and the demonstrations became illegal.
No, I don't think I want to be so precise about that. What I am very clear about is the blockade of the bridge made this a real economic crisis for Canada. And that was a moment when, as finance minister, I really had to figure out a way to stop the harm to Canada from getting worse and from really snowballing and irreparably damaging our country.
And you said because it had potentially exponential harm to the Canadian economy.
Yes, that I mean, I wasn't taking notes of what I said, but I believe that.
Yes. And that's when you started looking at the Bank Act and the PCLMFTA as potential, using the measures under that legislation to stop those demonstrations.
Again, here, let me be sort of very precise about my state of mind. From my perspective, we had a number of different, but certainly inspired by one another, occupations and blockades across the country. There was the occupation of Ottawa, and I can't tell you the chronology of them. I'm sure you're familiar with them. But so there's the occupation of Ottawa, there was Coutts, there was Emerson. In terms of economic impact, the Ambassador Bridge was the most significant. There was also, I believe, Sarnia, Niagara, and Surrey. So from my perspective, what was happening was this kind of metastasizing, whack-a-mole, copycat events around the country. And some of them had a greater specific economic impact than others. The Ambassador Bridge sort of stepped up the impact, but it was not the case, in my view, that this was just the Ambassador Bridge.
Okay. And that was not the purpose of my question, that
Okay.
It was only about the Ambassador Bridge. I understand your evidence that the blockades generally had a significant economic impact on Canada that you were concerned about. That's fair.
Again, can I say yes and offer an explanation?
I'm not trying to make this controversial or to trap you. I'm just trying to establish this to move on to my next point.
Okay, well, I would just say you are a lawyer, so a person does have to be careful.
Yeah.
But I say that with the greatest respect for all the lawyers who are here. But look, the point that I just want to be clear about, and I do think that there has been, in some of the public thinking about this, a lack of clarity, is from my perspective, one way that you could look at the economic harm was what happens every day arithmetically and just add it up. From my perspective, that grossly understates the potential economic harm that was being done. Because what I was really worried about was that as this goes on, every single hour, more damage is done to American confidence in us as a trading partner, and more damage is done to us as an investment destination. Witness the Banana Republic comment.
Right, and exactly. So you were concerned that this economic disruption was painting Canada as politically unstable, not a place that is safe to invest for, and potentially a Banana Republic, which by definition is an unstable country. That's fair.
Banana Republic wasn't my term, but it was a term that had an impact on me for sure.
Okay. Now, Minister Freeland, you can appreciate that from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, our concern is that the Emergencies Act should not be used to quash political dissent. You understand that?
I totally do. And if I can be personal for one moment, in my life as a person and a writer and an elected politician, I would always prefer for myself to be on the same side as the Civil Liberties Association. These are values I hold very dear, and so I understand the urgency with which you champion them.
Right, so I think you would also agree that the Emergencies Act should not be used because demonstrators are disagreeing with government policy. I think that's a very low threshold here that I'm putting to you.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that.
And I think you also know in your life, both as a journalist and as a minister, that on occasion, the right to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression includes actions that are of civil disobedience.
I do recognize that sometimes happens. And I also recognize that laws are enforced against people committing acts of civil disobedience. People can believe in something and can bravely commit those acts and pay the price of the legal penalty. And
exactly. And civil disobedience will, on occasion, also involve serious economic disruption. And I'll give you a few examples. A general strike is a form of civil disobedience that causes economic disruption. You'd agree with that?
If the tendency of these questions is to equate the economic harm that was being done to Canada and that would have risen had these illegal occupations and blockades continued with the harm done by a general strike, then I strongly disagree.
Okay. And sometimes blockades by Indigenous people cause economic harm, correct?
They do.
And sometimes occupations like Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Toronto may cause economic harm.
Certainly, but the economic harm, to take those two specific instances, very, very limited actually compared to the damage being done to Canada. And if I may, had what was happening in Canada been about, I don't know, the field behind the National Art Gallery being occupied for a long time, and maybe some comparable public park in Windsor being occupied, and so on across the country. That would have been entirely legitimate protest, but that wasn't what was happening.
Okay, maybe I can take you to an example closer to home. For me, when Solidarity had a general strike in Poland and blocked the ports, Western democracies applauded that action. That was economic disruption was viewed as a legitimate form of political protest at that time.
I'm going to allow myself one personal comment, which is I did make a bet with myself that you and I would end up talking about Solidarność.
Yeah, you know, coming from the Eastern Bloc, it was going to happen.
Yeah, I am aware of that. And I don't think you'll be surprised to think that I thought about that at the time. And more recently and more specifically, I thought about the Maidan in Ukraine. And when we took this action. And let me talk about a few differences. And the main one is this. Solidarność, as you know very well, was a protest against a government that was illegitimate. That was from whence it drew its power and legitimacy. This was people rising up against an authoritarian, and I would even say in the case of Poland, colonial regime.
Okay.
In Canada, what happened was a democratically elected government that was actually acting on policies that we had campaigned on just that summer. So it was a fresh democratic mandate. There was no lack of transparency with the people of Canada. And people who disagreed with those policies were holding the country's economy hostage.
Okay, Ms.
And
Freeland,
that was not appropriate.
I do want to raise a concern. I'm assuming you're not saying that democracy only operates at the time of casting our ballot. Obviously, I think you acknowledge that we are able to protest in between those times. So even after you were democratically elected, people could protest your government's policies, correct?
100%. And I am in no way suggesting that the act of protest is anti-democratic. On the contrary, the right to protest, I think it's a feature, not a bug of democracy. But what I was saying, which I believe very strongly, is there is a big difference between acts of popular resistance and even revolution against an authoritarian regime and protest in a democracy.
And Minister Freeland, I'd like to just take you to, you started your comments this morning as well with the bigger geopolitical issues here between President Putin trying to demonstrate that his way of dictatorships is preferable to Western democracies. And one, I think you can appreciate that there have been countries in the world that have said, you should invest in us because we are politically stable. We do not have general strikes. We do not tolerate dissent. And I want to end on this. Surely you agree that in Canada, which is a democracy, the right to protest, the right to demonstration must be sedulously protected, and that economic security does not trump those rights.
So many things packed in there.
I know, I'm running out of time, so it's all going in.
So many things packed in there, and many of them I agree with. I have reported on a lot of authoritarian regimes that spoke about their stability as something that should be attractive to investors. And clearly, I strongly disagree with that argument. My concern when it came to the economic security of Canada was about our ability not to not have political debate. Political debate is a sign of a healthy society. The fact we're having this commission, that's a healthy democracy. The fact that in question period we yell at each other. I really don't like it, but it's a sign of a healthy democracy. What was undermining of Canada's economic security sufficiently dangerously that I believe we needed to act and it was the right thing to do was that our trade was being stopped and was being seriously blocked. And I was very worried that that was handing arguments to US protectionists who were already on the move, and that had that relationship been seriously damaged, that would really hurt Canada.
Minister, my last point, you mentioned at some point that it would have been one thing for the protesters to stand with a placard at the War Museum and protest. You mentioned that today in testimony with me.
I didn't say War Museum and I didn't say placard.
Sorry.
But the basic idea, I think we're in the same
I'm sorry,
zone.
I'm thinking of a different Ottawa monument. But you agree that public assembly and the right to protest goes beyond simply me standing on a green lawn in front of a government building, that it does encompass more than that, and that Canada should protect that to be a vibrant democracy.
I, am not going to right now try to define with you specifically, what is, give examples of protests. But what I will say, and I really agree with, and I think one of the lines that were very much in my mind in this decision is I do agree with you that in a democracy, the right to protest is important and has to be protected. And that's such an obvious statement, and I agree with that. And I agree, so since it's obvious, I'll say it and I won't gild the lily.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Commissioner Rouleau.